Imagine it's a cold morning in November 2015. You're a 34-year-old schoolteacher living in Ordos, in Inner Mongolia, China. You just bought a brand new apartment in a district called Kangbashi, 20 minutes from the old town. The building is beautiful. Wide marble lobby, glass elevators, a fountain outside that lights up at night. You paid your life savings as a down payment, and your parents helped with the rest. You believed, like everyone around you, that this apartment was not just a home. It was an investment, a guarantee, something that could only go up in value, because that's what everyone had been told for years. If you have ever wondered why entire cities in China can sit almost empty with skyscrapers and highways and stadiums but barely any people walking the streets, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before in different countries in different decades, and it always follows the same hidden logic. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. You move into your new apartment in Kangbashi expecting neighbors, shops, noise, life. Instead, you find silence. Half the building is dark at night. The shopping mall downstairs has a few stores open, surrounded by dozens of empty storefronts with paper taped over the glass. The wide 6-lane road outside your window, built for a population of 1 million people, carries maybe a few hundred cars a day. You start to notice something you didn't want to admit. This isn't a city waiting to be filled. This might be a city that was never supposed to be filled. At all. Not in the way you were told. The apartment you bought wasn't really built for you to live in. It was built so that a number could go up on a government report, so that a local official could get promoted, so that a bank could make another loan, so that a steel mill could keep running. You were the last domino in a chain you never even knew existed. This video is about that chain. It's about why China built more empty apartments than entire countries have homes for their populations. It's about the difference between what a city looks like and what a city actually is. And it's about a pattern that is repeated again and again throughout history, whenever growth gets measured by building things instead of by whether people actually need them. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about how this entire system works. Think of an economy like a body. Healthy growth is like a bodybuilding muscle through real exercise, slow, earned, and useful. But there's another way to make a body look bigger. You can inject it with something artificial. It puffs up fast. It looks impressive in photographs, but it isn't real muscle. And underneath, something is going wrong. China's growth model, especially at the local government level, worked a lot like that injection. For decades, the main way a local Communist Party official got promoted in China was by hitting GDP growth targets, GDP being just a fancy term for the total value of everything produced and built in an area in 1 year. The fastest, easiest way to boost that number wasn't to grow real businesses slowly. It was to build things, roads, bridges, apartment towers, stadiums. Building things counts as economic activity the moment construction starts, whether or not anyone ever uses what gets built. So local officials, hungry for promotion, partnered with developers and borrowed enormous amounts of money to build entire new districts almost overnight. The land itself became the asset. Local governments in China don't really own land outright to sell freely. They sell long-term leases on land use rights, and this became one of their biggest sources of revenue. The more land they developed and sold, the richer the local government looked, on paper. This is the secret key to the whole ghost city phenomenon. These were never primarily homes. They were financial instruments wearing the costume of homes. This brings us directly to the first real historical case that shows exactly how this pattern plays out. And it isn't even from China. It's from Japan in the late 1980s. Picture Tokyo in 1989. Japan's economy was the envy of the world. Banks were lending freely against rising land prices. There's a famous, half-joking claim from that era that the land underneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was, on paper, worth more than the entire state of California. That's not a typo. That's how detached prices had become from anything resembling real economic value. Japanese banks lent money based on the assumption that real estate prices would just keep climbing forever. Companies borrowed against their land holdings to buy more land. Ordinary families stretched themselves thin to get onto the property ladder before prices ran away from them completely. Then, starting around 1991, the Bank of Japan raised interest rates to cool things down, and the whole structure began cracking. Land prices in major Japanese cities fell for years, by some measures, commercial. Real estate values eventually dropped more than 80% from their peak over the following decade. Banks that had lent against inflated land values were suddenly holding loans worth far more than the actual property behind them. This created what's called a balance sheet recession, meaning companies and households spent years not trying to grow, but simply trying to pay down debt that was now bigger than their actual wealth. Japan entered what's often called the lost decade, though in truth it stretched into more than 2 decades of weak growth. Ordinary Japanese workers who had bought homes near the peak found themselves trapped, owing more on their mortgage than their home was worth, sometimes for 20 or 30 years. Meanwhile, the bankers and developers who had cashed out early, who had sold their land holdings at the top before the crash, kept their gains. The mechanism here is simple, even if it doesn't feel simple when you're inside it. When growth gets built on the assumption that an asset's price can only rise, the system rewards whoever builds and sells the most, the fastest, regardless of whether the underlying thing, the land, the apartment, the office tower, actually serves a real human need. The rot was in the beams, not on the surface. From the outside, 1980s Japan looked like the strongest economy on earth. Underneath, the entire financial system was leaning on a single assumption that was quietly becoming false. This leads to the second part of the story, and here we go to Spain in the years right before 2008. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. If a country can build more homes per year than it has new households to fill, then who exactly is buying all of those homes and why? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously. Because what I'm about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes how you'll see every skyline you look at from now on. Between roughly 2000 and 2008, Spain built more new homes some years than Germany, France, and the United Kingdom combined, despite having a far smaller population. Entire new towns went up along the Spanish coast and around Madrid, developments with names like Cesena, sometimes nicknamed the city built for nobody, where thousands of apartments stood, finished but empty for years. Why did this happen? Spanish banks, especially regional savings banks called cajas, were flush with cheap credit after Spain joined the euro, which gave it access to interest rates far lower than its economy had ever experienced before. Local politicians, much like in China, benefited politically and financially from rezoning land and approving massive developments. Construction became one of the largest employers in the entire Spanish economy. At its peak, construction made up close to 18% of Spain's total economic output, an extraordinarily high number for any developed country. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary Spanish workers left other jobs to work in construction because the wages were good and the work seemed endless. Then, in 2008, the global financial crisis hit. Credit dried up overnight, and the buying simply stopped. Spain was left with an estimated 1 million or more unsold or unfinished homes. Unemployment in Spain eventually rocketed past 26%, with youth unemployment exceeding 50% in the worst years. Construction workers who had bought their own homes near the peak, believing the boom would never end, found themselves jobless and underwater on mortgages they could no longer afford. Some banks, like Bankia, needed massive government bailouts just to survive. The people who did fine through this were largely the original landowners who sold early, and the bank executives who restructured their institutions with government help, while ordinary depositors and small investors absorbed the losses. Now look at what Japan and Spain share, even though they are separated by an ocean, a language, and 20 years. In both cases, building became disconnected from actual demand. In both cases, easy and cheap borrowing made it possible to keep building long after real need had been satisfied. In both cases, local political incentives, promotions in Japan's case through different channels, direct political and financial gain in Spain's case, pushed officials and developers to keep the machine running even as warning signs piled up. This is where it gets interesting because now we return to China and we add a third case study that makes the pattern impossible to ignore. China's property boom, especially from roughly 2000 through 2021, dwarfs both Japan's and Spain's in raw scale. At one point, China was estimated to be using more cement in just a few years than the United States used in the entire 20th century. Entire cities were built from scratch, not just suburbs, but full cities, with government buildings, opera houses, and 6-lane highways, years before there were enough people to live in them. The city of Ordos, where our school teacher, from the opening of this video lived, became one of the most famous examples, sometimes referred to in international media as China's largest ghost town. Researchers and journalists who visited around 2010 to 2015 found entire residential districts with completion rates over 80%, but occupancy rates estimated at well under 50%, sometimes far lower. The mechanism behind it was the same one we just saw in Japan and Spain, but turbocharged by China's unique political structure. Local governments, which relied on land, sales for a huge share of their revenue. By some estimates, land sales and related fees provided close to a third or more of local government income in many Chinese cities, had every incentive to keep developing more land, regardless of whether existing developments had filled up. Developers like Evergrande, once China's largest property developer by sales, borrowed staggering amounts of money to build faster and faster, expanding into hundreds of cities. By 2021, Evergrande was sitting on more than $300 billion in total liabilities, debts owed to banks, suppliers, bondholders, and ordinary homebuyers who had paid in advance for apartments that, in many cases, were never finished. When Evergrande defaulted, it triggered a cascade across the entire Chinese property sector, with other major developers like Country Garden following into financial distress shortly after. Estimates from researchers, including economist Kenneth Rogoff, have suggested that China's real estate and related sectors at their peak made up close to a quarter, or even more, of the entire Chinese economy. An extraordinary concentration of national wealth riding on one single industry whose core product, in far too many cases, sat empty. Now, observe what all three of these cases have in common. Same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. In Japan, in Spain, and in China, the system mistook the speed of building for the health of the economy. In each case, cheap or politically incentivized credit flowed toward construction, regardless of whether real families actually needed those homes right now. In each case, local actors, banks in Japan, regional savings institutions in Spain, local governments in China, had personal or institutional incentives to keep the machine running long after the warning signs were visible to anyone paying close attention. And in each case, the people who got hurt the worst were not the architects of the system. They were the ordinary people who trusted it. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep looking at a skyline and assume that tall buildings mean a strong economy. If you're still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next part of this is the part this channel was made for. The part where we talk about who actually pays the price when illusions like this collapse, and who, quietly, walks away just fine. So who actually gets hurt the most when a ghost city economy unravels? In every one of our case studies, it's almost never the people at the top. In Japan, it was ordinary salaried workers who bought apartments near the peak of the bubble in places like Tokyo and Osaka, some of whom were still paying off mortgages on properties worth a fraction of their original price more than 2 decades later. In Spain, it was construction workers, many of them young men who had left school early because construction wages were so good during the boom, who found themselves with no job, no savings, and a mortgage on a half-empty development by the coast. In China, it's millions of ordinary families like our school teacher in Ordos, families who used their entire life savings as down payments because property had been culturally treated as the safest possible investment for an entire generation. It's also the migrant construction workers who built these cities, some of whom went unpaid for months when developers ran out of cash, leading to public protests outside company offices in cities like Shenzhen and Wuhan in 2021 and 2022. Pensioners and retirees who put their retirement savings into investment products linked to property developers, called trust products or wealth management products, sold by banks as safe and stable, found those products frozen or worthless when the underlying developers defaulted. Small business owners who opened shops in these new districts, betting that residents would eventually arrive, watched their storefronts sit empty year after year, paying rent on commercial space with no customers walking by. Meanwhile, those who walked away largely fine fall into a few familiar categories across all our case studies. Original landowners who sold their land rights early before the music stopped, locked in their gains regardless of what happened afterward. Senior executives at major developers, in several documented cases in China, had reportedly moved significant personal wealth offshore in the years before their companies collapsed, even as the companies themselves owed enormous debts to homebuyers and workers. Large, state-connected banks, in both Japan's and China's cases, were ultimately supported or restructured with government assistance, protecting institutional balance sheets in ways that individual families' personal savings never were. This is the uncomfortable, recurring truth underneath. Nearly every one of these episodes throughout modern history. The risk in the system rarely sits where the reward sits. The people closest to the actual construction of the illusion, the bankers structuring the loans, the officials approving the land sales, the executives managing the companies, tend to have far more ability to exit before the collapse than the ordinary families, who only see what's happening once it's already too late to act. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that question many times over, in Tokyo, in Madrid, and now across dozens of Chinese cities. The only real question for each of us, as individuals trying to make sense of the economic world around us, is whether we can learn to see the difference between an asset that's actually useful and an asset whose price is simply going up because everyone believes it will keep going up. If this channel helps you think differently about the systems shaping the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change how you read every headline about economic growth for the rest of your life. What did the people who came through these crises with their financial lives intact actually do differently? The historical record, looking carefully across Japan, Spain, and China, shows that those who navigated these collapses, largely shared a few clear characteristics. And none of them involve predicting the future, because almost nobody predicted the exact timing of any of these collapses. The first characteristic was simple skepticism toward concentration. People who survived these periods relatively well tended not to have their entire net worth tied up in a single asset class, in a single city, or in a single country's property market. When one part of their financial life took a hit, it didn't take down everything else with it. The second characteristic was a focus on cash flow over paper value. Investors and families who asked, does this actually generate real income or serve a real need right now? Rather than, will this be worth more later because everyone says so, were far less exposed when sentiment shifted. An empty apartment generating zero rental income is fundamentally different from an apartment with a paying tenant, even if both show the same price on paper. The third characteristic was attention to debt, specifically the difference between debt used to build something income-producing versus debt used purely to speculate on rising prices. Households and companies that kept their borrowing modest relative to their actual income had far more breathing room when credit conditions tightened suddenly, as they did in Japan in 1991, in Spain in 2008, and across China starting around 2020 and 2021. None of this is a guarantee, and none of it is advice about what anyone should do with their own money. Today, it's simply what the historical pattern shows about who weathered these storms and who didn't. Let's go back to our school teacher in Ordos. By around 2018, 3 years after moving in, her building had filled in somewhat, not completely, but enough that the silence felt less eerie. Local government incentives shifted slightly, subsidies brought in some new residents, and a handful of businesses managed to survive downstairs. She kept her apartment. She didn't lose everything, but the value of her home never came close to matching what she had been told to expect when she bought it. And years of her family's savings remained tied up in an asset that, even now, trades far below its original promise. Multiply her story by tens of millions of families across hundreds of Chinese cities, and you start to see the true scale of what we've been describing. Not a single dramatic crash captured in one headline, but a slow, grinding unwind that's still playing out today. One unfinished building, one frozen trust product, one unpaid construction worker at a time. The lie at the heart of the ghost city phenomenon was never really about empty buildings. The lie was the idea that building fast and building big is the same thing as building wealth. It isn't. A city is not valuable because it exists. A city is valuable because people live and work and build lives inside it. When you separate the act of construction from the actual presence of human life and economic need, you don't create wealth. You create the appearance of wealth propped up by debt, and debt always eventually asks to be repaid. Collapse, in cases like these, is rarely a single dramatic fire. It's closer to a river slowly changing course. Quiet, gradual, and almost invisible until you realize the water has moved somewhere else entirely, and the old riverbed, the one everyone built their homes around, has been dry for years. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it, scroll past it, and keep looking at skylines the same way they always have. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, someone about to put their life savings into something simply because everyone around them says it can only go up, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and I will see you in the next one.